Listen, the perfect way to kill a promising startup is not lack of funding. It is bad equity splits that turns friends into enemies, scares investors away, and leaves you trapped in your own company. I have seen brilliant products die because the founder did not understand one thing. Equity is not just ownership. Equity is control, incentives, and future bargaining power. A startup team came to me after they had built a working product. They were excited, users were joining, and one investor was already asking for their cap table. Everything looked like a win until I asked one simple question. Who owns what and why? They told me casually that they had split their equity 50-50. One person had the idea and raised small money from friends. The other person built the software. At first, that sounds fair until you ask the question that investors always ask. Who works full-time? Who can actually execute? What happens if someone disappears? What happens if there is a fight? What happens if you need to hire talent and you have no equity left? What happens when you raise money and dilution starts? 2 months later, the builder got a better job offer abroad. He stopped showing up. There was no handover, no documentation, no support, but he still owned half of the company. Now imagine the painful parts. The person who stayed was doing everything, paying for servers, handling customers, chasing partnerships, but he could not make certain decisions without the inactive 50% co-founder. Investors ran because nobody wants to invest in a deadlock. That company did not fail because the product was bad. It failed because the equity split was lazy. It was not structured to match reality. So how do you properly split equity in a startup? You split equity based on value and risk and not sentiments. And value in a startup is not just the idea, because ideas are common. Execution is rare. Staying power is everything. When you are splitting equity, you are basically asking who is carrying what weight, for how long, with what risk, and with what accountability. Here is the part many founders miss. Equity is a promise about the future. It is you saying, if you stay and build, you earn ownership over time. That phrase, over time, is where most startups become either investable or they have a lot of drama. Now, I once worked with two friends who were co-founders that started a service-based tech business. They were not fully sure that it would work, but they were very passionate. They shared equity on day one. They did an equal split with no vesting. They also gave a third party a chunk of shares for making introductions for them. Fast forward, the startup began to grow. Then the person making the introduction stopped being useful. The second founder began reducing his efforts because he felt the first founder was working harder anyways. Resentment started to grow. When they came to me, the first founder said something that broke the whole room. I feel like I'm building a future for people who are no longer building with me. That is exactly what happens when equity is split without a structure that protects the company. So what is the structure? The structure is vesting, clear rules, and clear documents that match the cap table. A proper equity split usually comes from asking 5 practical questions. The first question is who works full-time and who works part-time. The second question is who is taking personal risk and how much. The third question is who is bringing critical skills that the company cannot survive without. The fourth question is who is responsible for revenue and growth, not just tax. The fifth question is who is accountable when things go wrong. Equity should reward responsibility and long-term commitment. That is why vesting exists. Vesting simply means that you do not get all your shares immediately. You earn them as you work and stay, because the company is not buying your excitement. The company is buying your consistency. Most serious startups use a vesting structure where ownership is earned monthly over a set period of time, often with an initial cliff period, meaning if you leave too early, you leave with nothing or almost nothing. Why does that matter? Because it protects the company from free riders. It protects the committed founder from carrying passengers. It protects investors from messy ownerships. Now let's talk about what founders really want to know. What is a fair equity split? There is no magical percentage that fits everyone, but there are patterns that usually make sense. If both founders are equally committed, equally skilled in complementary areas, and both are full-time with equal risk, then a close equity split can work. If one founder is full-time and the other founder is part-time, then the equity split should reflect that reality. If one founder is putting in capital early, not just promises, that should be recognized as either equity or as a convertible instrument or as a loan, depending on the plan. If someone is only offering advice, introductions, or occasional support, they usually do not deserve founder-level equity. This is where advisory equity comes in, smaller, structured, and with vesting too. And there is another thing founders forget. Your equity split must have room for the future, because you will need to hire. You will need key employees. You will likely set up an employee equity pool so you can attract talent without paying crazy salaries in the very early stage. If you split the equity tightly between co-founders, you will have no flexibility. Then when you want to hire a top developer or a sales lead, you will be forced to beg for shares from founders, and that becomes a conflict again. Now let us enter the legal parts that separate serious startups from WhatsApp startups, the documents. Because investors do not invest in just an idea. They invest in structure. And the two documents that people confuse all the time are these: a share subscription agreement and a share purchase agreement. They sound similar, but they do very different things. Let me break it down in the simplest way. A share subscription agreement is used when a person is buying new shares directly from the company, meaning the company is issuing new shares and collecting money directly into the company. This is what happens in most fundraising. New investors bring money, the company issues new shares, the company gets funded, the cap table is updated, and everyone is diluted a bit depending on the round. So subscription is primary investment. The money goes into the company. Meanwhile, a share purchase agreement is used when a person is buying existing shares from an existing shareholder, meaning the company is not issuing new shares. The money goes to the seller, not to the company. This usually happens when a founder sells part of their shares, an early investor sells to a new investor, or a departing co-founder is bought out, or even an employee selling vested shares if it is allowed. So purchase is a secondary transaction. The money goes to the person selling. Now, let me tell you one of my client stories that will shock you. The startup was raising money from an angel investor. They agreed on a valuation and investor paid. Simple, or so they thought. There was no share subscription agreement. There was no proper board approval process laid down in the shareholders agreement. There was no allotment of shares, no updated register of members, nothing clean. Months later, another investor came in for due diligence. The first thing they asked was, show me the subscription documents, the proof of allotment, and the proof that the shares were properly issued. The founders were confused. They said the money entered the account. The investor basically responded that money entering the company's account is not proof of ownership. That one gap delayed the funding round. Lawyers got involved and the investor reduced his offer because the startup looked too risky. This is why a share subscription agreement matters. It defines exactly what is being subscribed to, how many shares, at what price, what class of shares, what rights come with it, what conditions must be met before completion, like board resolutions, regulatory filings, and updates to statutory registers, and also what promises the company is making, like that it is properly incorporated, that it owns the intellectual property, that there are no hidden disputes. It turns the investment from a casual transfer into a clean, enforceable transaction. Now, where does the share purchase agreement come in for founders? Let me give you a practical scenario. A co-founder leaves early. Maybe they are burnt out, maybe conflicts, maybe life happens, but they already hold shares. If you do not have vesting and buyback rights embedded in the shareholders agreement, you are stuck. If you do have vesting and proper documentation, the company or the remaining founders can buy back the unearned portion, or sometimes even the earned portion, depending on the agreement. But that buyback needs a clean share purchase agreement, or at least a proper transfer process captured in legal documentation. A share purchase agreement will set out the shares being sold, the price, how payment will happen, and the legal protections so the buyer does not inherit liabilities. And here is what many founders do wrong. They think equity is just a spreadsheet. So they agree by charts. They update their cap table in Google Sheets. They do not do board resolutions. They do not file returns where required. They do not update registers. They do not document transfers. Then one day, when money is about to enter, the whole thing collapses under legal scrutiny. Now, let us connect this back to properly splitting equity from day one. When equity is split properly, three things are clear. One, who earns what over time? Through vesting. Two, what happens if someone leaves? Through leaver protections and buyback clauses embedded in the shareholders agreement. Three, how new money comes in? Through share subscription agreements. And how old shares change hands through a share purchase agreement. This is the maturity line between a startup that can raise money and a startup that will keep building but never scale. Now, let me speak directly to founders. If you are watching this and you have co-founders, ask yourself these questions today. If one person disappears next month, can the company survive legally? If one person becomes difficult, can you remove them from ownership fairly? If an investor asks you for your cap table and supporting documents, can you provide clean answers? If you need to bring in an investor, do you even know whether you are using a share subscription agreement or a share purchase agreement? Because once you get this wrong, it becomes expensive to fix. It is cheaper to structure it early than to repair it later when there is already conflict or you're already under serious investor pressure. And if you are thinking, we'll fix it later, later is when people are emotional. And emotions destroy negotiations. So what should you do now? Make sure the equity split is based on clear contributions and commitments. Put vesting in place. Reserve room for talent through an employee equity pool. And document every issuance of shares and transfer of shares properly using the right agreement for the right transaction. So if you want help structuring your equity splits, cleaning up your cap table, or drafting the right share purchase agreement or share subscription agreement for your exact situation, send me an email at sanhonlegal@gmail.com. Because the goal is not just to start. The goal is to build a company that you actually own, control, and a company that you can raise funds without chaos. If this helps you, subscribe, because in the next video, I'll break down the most common clauses investors use to control founders and how you can negotiate them without killing the deal.